It's tempting to say there's something nostalgic in the water when it comes to Nintendo's exclusives as of late. Pokopia argued that Pokémon can and should remain tethered to the first generation, ultimately revealing that the world you were tasked with rebuilding was for the benefit of an aging millennial fanbase. The next big release as of this video's publishing is Star Fox, another remake of Star Fox 64. An Ocarina of Time remake is slated to be the big holiday title for 2026. Given the lineup, it would be easy to declare this as the beginning of a particularly backwards-facing era for Nintendo, one focused on remembering and repackaging experiences from the 90s rather than pushing their long-running series in new directions. Now, it's entirely possible future years will decide to follow in 2026's footsteps, in which case I will become more sympathetic to negative assessments like this. However, I think we must resist the urge to be too doom and gloom just yet. It's worth pointing out that this is hardly Nintendo's first foray into large-scale 20th century-fueled frenzies. In fact, if we turn the clock back about a decade and then some, I think we'll arrive at a moment far more nostalgic than our current one, the 3DS and Wii U era. Let's not forget that this era, starting with the 3DS's launch in 2011, also began with a remake of Star Fox 64 and Ocarina of Time. So at least we can say the Switch 2 waited until its second year to do this. Why do I find the 3DS Wii U era to be especially nostalgic? Well, to answer that, we can't limit our discussion to only what remakes came out during this period. No, my diagnosis is primarily based on the era's original games, which often seem to be drowning in their own history, interested in echoing and paying reverence to their most acclaimed predecessors. On the echoing side of the spectrum, we had many sequels whose appeal came from the fact that they were iterations on established formula, taking games like Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, Kirby Triple Deluxe, Kirby Planet Robobot, and Yoshi's New Island into account. On the reverential side of the spectrum, we only need to take a look at Pokémon's output. While you could reasonably argue nostalgia is just the default mode of operation for Pokémon, Generations 6 and 7 strike me as the most wistful of the bunch. X and Y intentionally forefronting a traditional Pokémon experience to ground the series' transition into 3D, and maybe also as a reaction to the relative unpopularity of Gen 5's perceived alterations to the formula. Meanwhile, the latter used its status as the series' 20th anniversary to make its connection to Generation 1 explicit and unmistakable. Sun and Moon breathed new life into the Kanto Pokédex through the introduction of exclusive regional variants and loved to invoke Kanto by name or through brief cameo appearances, on top of other legacy characters from across generations. Furthermore, its narrative implied that Alola could only become a legitimate region in the eyes of the Pokémon universe should it successfully plead fealty to Kanto's sensibilities. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon only served to make the Kanto connections more apparent in form and function, much to my personal dismay. Yet Super Mario took the crown by far for being the most blatantly backwards-facing series of the era. Notably, the great homogenization that spread through New Super Mario Bros. And the Mario RPGs settled on a very specific point in Mario's history. We were not being bored to death by hordes of standardized Piantas or Lumas, but Toads, Yoshis, and Koopalings. The advertising for games like Super Mario 3D Land or New Super Mario Bros. 2 focused on reintroducing power-ups like the Tanuki suit or the raccoon tail, respectively. In other words, the standard template for Mario was derived from the likes of Super Mario Bros., especially Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World. These were the games to follow, not just in their iconography, but in their very structure. 3D Mario games, which tended to offer more free-form exploration, leaned far closer to the traditional course-clear formula with 3D Land and 3D World, though Super Mario Galaxy 2 was clearly leading us in this direction beforehand. Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon adopted a level-based structure for mansion exploration. Paper Mario Sticker Star and Color Splash framed themselves around standard 2D Mario levels and world maps. Given the pattern, I argue a significant part of the aesthetic and structural sameness of early 2010s Mario was a function of the larger nostalgic machine powering Nintendo. The pull of the 80s and 90s was inescapable. The Legend of Zelda, of course, was by no means exempt from this trend. The Wii U's major Zelda releases consisted of a remastering of 2 previous games, and its sole exclusive title, Hyrule Warriors, was explicitly billed as a fan service extravaganza, which, in fairness, it ended up being pretty good at. The 3DS shared a similar fate, being home to the aforementioned Ocarina of Time remake and a later Majora's Mask one. There were promises of a big shakeup for Zelda in the future, but that never materialized pre-Switch. In the 3DS Wii U days, what we got was either literally the past, or something very fond of reminding us of it. It is in this context we arrive at A Link Between Worlds, the era's most notable Zelda game. How this game fits into the broader trend I've outlined is unavoidable. Worlds is a reimagining of A Link to the Past, one of gaming's most historic epics from the 90s, which utilizes both a similar structure to A Link to the Past and takes place in a nearly screen-to-screen remake of its overworld. What makes A Link Between Worlds interesting, however, is that it doesn't settle for only being an extension of the trend. It's also one of the few games in the era that wants to have a conversation about it. You, my dear, are perfection. How can you stand being so lovely, surrounded by these filthy fools? I will put you on a pedestal, or rather, upon a wall, perfect forever. Having Yuga try to capture perfection in a portrait while traipsing around a recreation of the most influential Zelda game is no accident. It is a tacit acknowledgement of nostalgia's true purpose, an expression of A Link Between Worlds' desire to locate and maintain the essence of the series. If Mario was able to capture perfection by placing Super Mario Bros. 3 on a pedestal, could Zelda not do the same with A Link to the Past? A Link Between Worlds has 2 claims to fame: its non-linear progression facilitated by the item rental system and the wall merging mechanic. For now, let's only consider the first. Because nearly all of the game's core items are available for use at or near the start, barring the Desert Palace, the game's major dungeons can be tackled in any order upon first entering Lorule. We might have called this a novel thing for Zelda at the time. Certainly when Worlds released, the level of freedom it offered hadn't been done to this degree in Zelda before. However, consider that novelty might not be what Worlds is appealing to with this open-ended approach. It might be helpful to consider Worlds as analogous to something like Pokemon X and Y here. In the same way that X and Y's more traditional structure was a response to the changing series priorities offered by Black and White, there's a sense that A Link Between Worlds is a response to the linearity of the Zelda games which preceded it, most notably Skyward Sword. And Skyward Sword was not an isolated incident, but instead the tail end of a trend, coming after 3 increasingly linear 3D Zeldas. Likewise, it would be hard to argue 2D Zeldas like Minish Cap, Phantom Hourglass, or Spirit Tracks were games rife with player choice. I mean, Spirit Tracks was literally Zelda on rails. The reason linearity in games like Skyward Sword was noticed was because there was the sense Zelda did not used to be this way, that the older games like the original Zelda, or pertinently A Link to the Past, offered flexibility in how to approach its dungeons over its sequels. There was the sense that these older titles were more about encouraging and rewarding player curiosity than fulfilling a strict set of prescribed objectives. Taken in this way, A Link Between Worlds' item rental system does not seem so novel at all. Rather, it represents a back-to-basics approach, a desire to recapture and expand upon the original spirit of Zelda that had somehow been lost along the way. The antidote to Skyward Sword's maladies was to look back at A Link to the Past and relearn its lessons, follow its formula, and finally create the perfect portrait of a Zelda game. A perfection they would evidently continue to iterate on come Breath of the Wild. There's reason to be skeptical of A Link Between Worlds' mission. Yuga's quest for perfection is framed as a sort of pillaging. My little acquisition tour of Hyrule is nearly over, princess. It really was quite a spree. A sage here, a sage there, and now you're Impa too. To try to freeze a series in a moment of perfection runs the risk of stagnation, or worse, misunderstanding. How do you know if you've gotten it right? What parts need to be maintained and which need to be discarded? And who gets to decide which elements are worth preserving in the first place? The selectiveness of Yuga's perfection demonstrates a callous disrespect towards the subjects he's attempting to capture. I find your protests inelegant, not to mention irrelevant. I wish only to possess your beauty, Princess Zelda of Hyrule, not all these ugly words of yours. There's something pointed in the game saying this to Zelda, a character who, despite being the series' namesake, has largely been marginalized by its narratives. Trapped in crystal, petrified, excised, non-existent, and in the few instances where she is featured prominently, forced behind a veil or shrouded in obscurity. Playing A Link Between Worlds again, it becomes an even more embarrassing look for Echoes of Wisdom that the first mainline Zelda to have a playable Zelda did not let her speak. It seems Yuga was not the only one who didn't desire any of Zelda's ugly words. The common folly with looking to the past for perfection is that there is often too much uncritical replication and too little assessment of which things should probably stay in the past. It is with this understanding that A Link Between Worlds begins to reshape the portrait a little. Worlds can't help but tweak some of the past, to poke and prod and see what it can get away with. And what might seem like a small change ends up having far larger consequences. Take the blacksmiths, for example. In A Link to the Past, the only way to reach this location was by traveling to Kakariko, either by passing through the northern entrance near Sanctuary in the Skull Woods, or through the southern entrance close to the swamp. It was kind of a hassle to get there. But in A Link Between Worlds, connectors have been added so that the blacksmith can be accessed just west of the entrance to Hyrule Castle, or by heading south from the lake next to the Sanctuary. These connections create, in effect, a third faster entrance to the blacksmith and Kakariko. This little change is quite possibly one of the most convenient things Worlds has done for planning travel routes through Hyrule. These connections are so intuitive, so obvious, I was shocked on my replay of A Link to the Past to learn that they were in fact an invention of its sequel, not something that had always been there. Indeed, even Worlds seems to recognize their significance, to the point that they are the first thing the game directs you towards. As soon as you exit Link's house, Gully demands you visit him in the blacksmiths by taking one of the newly added routes. Having easier access to the blacksmiths is a sensible choice narratively, considering the location takes on a more significant role in Worlds than it did in past. But it has an additional effect for those who know this overworld well. In its first few moments, A Link Between Worlds wants you to recognize that not everything is as it was. To that end, A Link Between Worlds' most impactful alteration to the portrait lies in something more subtle than structure or world design. It's a change in attitude. One of the remarkable things about going back to A Link to the Past was observing how unsentimental it was. Several characters crumpled or withered away in front of you, but there was little fanfare or acknowledgement of it. Link was simply witness to their final moments, and that remains the end of it. It's hard to describe how the people of Hyrule existed and related to each other or its locales. Friends didn't last for long. Link spent most of the adventure isolated, and on the off chance he did meet someone, they either ran away to call the Hyrule police on him, or it was some random old man squatting in a desert cave. What was he doing here? The Dark World was even more stark. It was barren except for the few who had been transformed into animals, and the world itself only existed as a byproduct of Ganon's evil wish. Consequently, it was destroyed after Link collected the Triforce at the end of the game. Whereas this kind of destruction was a revelation in Link's Awakening, it was the twist which gave the game its title after all. A Link to the Past treated the same topic as a blunt matter of fact. There was very little to mourn with the Dark World's passing. And while Link did wish for the return of those we watched fade, there remains a coldness and a distance to the whole adventure. Things could not be more different in A Link Between Worlds. Great efforts have been made to give this Hyrule a sense of place, by which I mean it is easier to understand how each piece of the setting fits into the lives of the people living there. There's a villager in swimsuit gear looking towards the House of Gales, presumably because if you want to go swimming in Hyrule, you'd go to Lake Hylia. The owner of the milk bar wants us to take a bottle of milk to a man stuck near the Tower of Hera, presumably because if you were a daredevil looking to rock climb, you'd head to Death Mountain. A frantic Zora, who can't swim, complains that he can't return to his domain because the bridge has been taken out by a thief we later learn stole the Zora Queen's gemstone. Kakariko Village has been made a more bustling, lively place. The blacksmiths have been reimagined as a husband-wife duo who spend the game worrying about their son Gully, himself a more concrete version of the ethereal flute boy. Even the game's fast travel system has been given an attitude, with Irene the Witch making commentary every time you request to use her broom. This fast travel is going to be coming out of her time, remember? Those last two examples are another significant point in A Link Between Worlds' favor. In A Link to the Past, the Seven Maidens were, with perhaps the exception of Zelda, if we're feeling generous, interchangeable personalities whose only screen time was a few sentences of exposition after each dungeon. By contrast, A Link Between Worlds strategically ensures that we spend at least a scene with each of the seven sages in the first third of the game before they're swiped away by Yuga. The sages don't threaten to become amazing characters because of these brief encounters, but it is in my view a good instinct that A Link Between Worlds thinks we ought to fraternize with the people we're going to be rescuing. It's an instinct the game applies wholeheartedly to its version of the Dark World, Lorule. And unlike the Dark World, Worlds really wants us to consider its twisted version of Hyrule as a living place, a world with its own agency. To achieve this, Worlds, as it did with Hyrule, makes efforts to sketch out each segment of Lorule so as to have a more defined role within the larger workings of the kingdom. In A Link to the Past, the village of outcasts was pretty hard to parse. Sure, there were two rabbit people who tried to mug you if you got too close, but it was never clear who the quote-unquote outcasts were, what that word even meant in this context, or why they would care so much about my money. What were they planning to buy, medicines of magic? On the other hand, there is an instant clarity to Thieves' Town. To the east, the milk bar's owner laments the newfound popularity of his tavern. The royal captain vents about the state of his job in the royal family. The bard speaks of a boss that has captured someone with knowledge on his treasure, the very same thief girl we end up saving once inside the dungeon. All around town are people singing lyrics to their own self-made motto, the keys to get into the thieves' hideout. To the west, a village crier offers salvation from a life of petty crime by adopting the visage of monsters. The chain of causality is clear. In the wake of disaster and monster attacks, might makes right became the law around Lorule, law which a small subset of Thieves' Town seemed determined to rebel against, though unlikely to succeed. These considerations carry over to other segments of Lorule. The Sanctuary region is firmly established as a former place of worship for the kingdom. A philosopher sits in the ruins of the old chapel and wonders if Lorule's collapse was because they abandoned the gods or vice versa. Large congregations of monsters meet up in Death Mountain to face off in gladiatorial brawls. Meanwhile, the region next to the Dark Palace has become the staging grounds for a cult, as Hilda explains. They were once former soldiers of Lorule Castle, who for one reason or another turned to worship a beast. I accept the responsibility. I was too weak to protect them. They were all good people. My people. Details like the ones I've just spent time listing were irrelevant to a game like A Link to the Past. There was no great need to establish the Dark World as a place with people surviving in it, because it was never a real place to begin with. It is, by contrast, why Worlds insists on having Hilda contact us each time we enter a new location. She exists to be a consistent reminder that Lorule is not some mistake, its creation not the whim of some evil wish, but a place with its own integrity and history. She must stop to give us context to remind us that, in fact, there is a context to be given. Lorule is just as real as Hyrule. Put simply, A Link Between Worlds is a version of A Link to the Past infused with pathos. While the game replicates existing series norms by sidelighting Zelda within a painting, it offers a counterbalance with Hilda. Worlds demonstrates that the Zelda series can create a compelling dimensional princess character using only a meager amount of screen time. As she earnestly helps Link navigate the dangers of her ruined kingdom, she looks on jealously at the framed portrait of Zelda. We all deserve a happy ending, don't we? So when Hilda reveals that she let Link gather the Triforce so that she could steal it for her kingdom, it is not the about-face it might have otherwise come across as. That's because the game has, through its insistent characterization of Lorule, openly and covertly articulated her desperation. Her motives are comprehensible because we better understand what and who Lorule matters to. A Link Between Worlds' sentimentality culminates in what might be the best, if understated, climax in Zelda's history. Ravio pleads for Hilda to learn the same lesson the game has asked of the player, to understand Hyrule and Lorule as equally valuable places. Lorule may be doomed, but at least our kingdom won't be condemned for stealing their Triforce. Lorule can only be a place worth caring about if it lives by its principles, Ravio argues. To destroy another kingdom in its place would be to miss the point of wanting Lorule back to begin with. Where A Link to the Past concluded with the blithe destruction of a misbegotten world, A Link Between Worlds instead chooses to salvage it. Link and Zelda use their Triforce to wish for the reappearance of Lorule's Triforce, thus beginning Lorule's revival. Hilda's dilemma was not resolved through pillaging or deceit, but through an act of kindness from two people who have every motivation not to want to help. The game ends on the tension it's been working through the entire time. Lorule crumbled because they changed the portrait too much. The Legend of Zelda conceptualizes itself as a series of perpetually repeating stories. A great villain appears, a great hero claims a great power to defeat said villain, and they and the power are sealed away until the struggle begins once again. Lorule thought they could end the fighting by breaking this cycle and rejecting the iconography so connected to the core of the series. But, A Link Between Worlds argues, they mustn't do this. To do so would be to lose the essence of Zelda. No, to have any chance of existing, Lorule must accept the Triforce as a fundamental part of their reality. There is perhaps something too hasty in this, in the game's insistence that these symbols must be present within the Legend of Zelda's portrait of perfection. There must always be Link, and Zelda, and Ganon, and sages, and a Triforce to be true Zelda. It's easy to imagine how that might not have to be the case. Frankly, we don't really have to imagine. Yet it's difficult to be too upset by the game's last-minute hedging. For all the moments where A Link Between Worlds makes a dull choice born from series tradition, there's a countervailing re-estimation of convention not far behind. A Link Between Worlds saw the way A Link to the Past viewed characters like Zelda and places like the Dark World and wondered if there wasn't room on the portrait for them to be more. Thus, Hilda and Lorule were born. A Link Between Worlds struggles with how much needs to change to reach perfection. It stays pretty close to the template, but in recreating its history, it did not become the thing I feared it might. An overfamiliar retread too paralyzed by its own legacy to make any real insight. No, the portrait this game paints moves. A Link Between Worlds is precisely why you shouldn't read my interpretation of the 3DS Wii U era as backwards-facing as an indictment of the era's quality. Despite the more aesthetically and structurally novel games in the Switch era, I find that I still have a preference for many of the games that were released in the time period prior. It might truly come down to games like A Link Between Worlds being a string of immediately and obviously effective choices. When you introduce a new character with the line, "My name is Princess Hilda, and I have failed you in every way," there is no faster way in the universe to get me invested in what this person is going to say next. No faster way to signal that you have a particular vision and purpose with what you're doing here. It's why I tracked the game's emotions so heavily. The retooling of the Dark World into Lorule and how that facilitates Ravio and Hilda's moral dilemma is such a transparently good dramatic anchor for the finale that it alone launches Worlds into my top 5 Zeldas. But I still feel a piece of the puzzle is missing. Narratively, I think I've shown that Worlds was able to find meaningful progress by revisiting its history, but can we say the same about what the game actually has you doing? It cannot escape the fact that it shares an almost identical overworld to A Link to the Past, and a majority of the items and tasks therein follow suit. However, if we remember the second of World's claims to fame, the wall merging, we won't have to worry much longer. This mechanic is vast enough to fully justify a revisit to A Link to the Past. Consider the epilogue to the Eastern Palace, another one of A Link Between Worlds' immediately and obviously effective choices. This Eastern Palace redux is so similar to the original, I think it would be fair to call it derivative. The aesthetic of the dungeon is identical, several rooms share almost one-to-one layouts and gimmicks, and the dungeon doesn't even bother to switch up its central item, the bow, to at least squeeze in a few new kinds of puzzles. It's only after fighting Yuga where the game finally introduces us to the wall merging and standard procedure gets thrown out the window. We would expect to get warped out of the dungeon, as is tradition for Zelda, but Worlds instead has us merge onto the dungeon's exterior walls and descend down until we reach the starting room again and exit properly. This brief tutorial clues us into the nuances of the mechanic. Because of the 2D nature of wall traversal, entering a slit while moving left will have you traveling to the right on the opposite side of the wall, if we maintain the same perspective. That means that the direction you enter from dramatically changes your resulting location. Because you can't change your height on a wall while merged, the game also teaches you to start the merge at different depths to reach otherwise inaccessible goodies on the opposite side of the dungeon. Safe to say there's nothing derivative at all about this portion of the Eastern Palace. It's as if the game is suggesting that the wall merge itself makes the meaningful difference between a stale rerun and something transformative. From here on out, Worlds will make good on the lateral thinking promised by these opening moments. In the same way, the freeform structure of Worlds was an extension of the non-linearity offered by A Link to the Past, the wall merging is an extension of another aspect of that game, the spatial reasoning tasks presented by the light-dark world distinction. Take the Bombos medallion. There, you had to recognize that the only way to get to the plaque sitting atop the desert cliff face was to swap from a lower elevation on a different screen in the dark world to the same spot at a higher elevation in the light world. This kind of puzzle is everywhere in A Link Between Worlds, and it's because of the wall merging. There are several screens where the solution to reaching an inaccessible area is to start from a higher elevation on a different screen, merge onto the wall, then follow that wall across screens until you land at that platform either at the correct elevation or higher. Creating these conundrums is also why Worlds has greatly expanded the number of fissures between Hyrule and Lorule compared to the portals between the light and dark world. It's also the function of a large portion of the hidden Maya-Mais. Taken all together, even when it's just for a secret gap in the back of a building, the wall merging has meaningfully expanded how you examine the overworld from A Link to the Past. There's a great deal of sense in A Link Between Worlds honing in on wall merging as its central gimmick. The kind of thinking required when merging intersects with a lot of quintessential Zelda design, like the need to make connections between rooms and how they interact, or the gradual learning and mastering of a space over time. If that sounds familiar, that's because it's exactly the same kind of thinking a good Zelda dungeon engages in. Following a wall across screens to get to a platform is not so different from solving a puzzle spanning across multiple floors, or even finding a key and realizing you need to head back to a previous part of the dungeon to progress. The fun is in realizing how the space fits together. It's why the terminal system in Breath and Tears' Beasts and Temples left a lot to be desired, because the terminals were set up to allow you to chunk each dungeon into a set of totally discrete units, which, in my opinion, defeats the purpose of them being called dungeons in the first place. The whole thing with dungeons is that the set of terminals are supposed to depend on one another, even if that dependency is only being behind a locked door. It is for this reason I feel I should defend A Link Between Worlds' dungeons against the brutal accusation that they are solid, if a bit underwhelming. I will concede that Worlds' dungeons are easier than previous Zeldas, thanks to the game's rental system ensuring you have the key item before entering, and the fact that the dungeons only design puzzles around a singular item, because they neither want to assume what order you're progressing through the game in, nor what items you might have rented at the time. However, I also think we shouldn't automatically conflate difficult with good, at least to a point. It might be better to ask if the dungeons are engaging. That is, do the dungeons still ask you to think about them as interconnected spaces? It's almost always the case that the more difficult the dungeon, the more it will ask you to do this. Still, I think we'll find that even the simplest of dungeons in A Link Between Worlds have figured out the secret to being engaging. We saw how the wall merging already facilitated the kinds of puzzles I'm talking about in the overworld. It's little surprise then that the game should be fond of wall merging puzzles inside dungeons too. The House of Gales is a fantastic escalation over what was going on in the Eastern Palace. Playing off of the depth constraints, many key items and paths will be just out of reach because they're too high relative to Link. The answer to these puzzles is to use other rooms in the dungeons to loop around to the starting room at a slightly higher elevation, opening new avenues to merge off from. Seriously, I can't believe how much I liked the House of Gales this time around. This is shockingly good stuff for a second or third dungeon. Later on, the Desert Palace takes advantage of the fact that the sand pillars created by the sand rod can themselves be used as walls. The dungeon has you exploring nearby rooms to flood other sections with sand so you can create said walls and new paths along with them. I wouldn't call either of these dungeons hard, certainly nowhere near what other 2D Zeldas have gotten up to, but neither do I think you can sleepwalk through them. That's sort of the genius of wall merging. Because it often has the effect of obscuring the path forward, by literally hiding the path in walls, the mechanic necessitates a strong level of intentionality when scanning any environment. As we saw with the sand rod, a lot of the time, A Link Between Worlds expects you to create your own path from nothing. The other critique Worlds' dungeons often face is that there is a flat difficulty curve, thanks to the game assuming each of the dungeons could be your first. This I don't quite agree with. It is true that you might have a lopsided difficulty curve depending on the order you tackle them in, but the game definitely contains easier and harder dungeons. As I mentioned before, the House of Gales is absolutely a cut above the Tower of Hera, and the Desert Palace is appreciably more complicated than Turtle Rock. Importantly, the difficulty of these places is intrinsic to the design of the place itself, and not dependent on how many hearts or sword upgrades you have at the time. That means that the Dark Palace, with its 3-tier layout in which you have to reveal all the light sources that reach the bottom floor, will always prove a step up in difficulty relative to the near-linear progression of the Skull Woods, no matter when in the game you do it. Truthfully though, the real reason I can't abide by any Worlds dungeon slander is because of the Ice Ruins, or more accurately, one specific moment in the Ice Ruins. The gimmick of this dungeon is that you have to follow a rotating block as you pull some tongue levers and make it move across the different floors. But at about the midpoint, this happens. Wow, a nice looking big chest, with an energy gauge increase, how fun. But then, stepping outside the chest room, a problem emerges. Where the hell did the block go? It just kinda vanished into thin air. The answer is actually very simple. You only need to take the rightmost exit from the switch room, go up the hallway, and then take the left exit at the top. It's more than possible to intuit that's the answer, because it's the only room that the block could have gone that's both north of the switch room and still on the floor above the chest. But that chest is exactly the thing. You aren't just going to take the rightmost exit, go up the hall, then to the left. You're going to drop down to get that ultimately optional chest and add an extra step to your backtracking. And since you've now been distracted and are looking at the layout of a different floor, the intuitiveness of where that block has gone is all but lost. I'll admit I got completely derailed by the big chest. I was wandering through all the different floors looking for any sign of where that block had moved to. It wasn't until I stopped, opened up my map, and looked carefully at the layout that I began to figure out what had really happened. It had been so long since a Zelda dungeon genuinely managed to stump me, but I wasn't frustrated at all. In fact, I was elated. That feeling is why I've always loved the dungeons so much. Getting lost and confused until you lock in and start dissecting the space piece by piece and figure it out. And if the ice ruins managed to do all of that for me, then surely it must be doing something right. It must be a legitimately good dungeon. So, despite the many factors that ought to work against Worlds' dungeons, I think the resulting collection is pretty fantastic. Here's the tier list. It's in no small part due to the fact that, in order to accommodate puzzles with the wall merging mechanic, the game is essentially forced into making neat spatial awareness puzzles on a constant basis. The strength of the central gimmick simply bleeds out into the rest of the game. My guess is that if I ever cover Oracle of Seasons and Ages, the season and time mechanics will similarly elevate those games. There's a certain irony to A Link Between Worlds 13 years later. After Tears of the Kingdom, the perennial Zelda debate has become how best to balance giving the player the freedom to do what they want, when they want, how they want, while at the same time offering a satisfyingly directed experience no matter where they choose to go first. In other words, it is the same debate A Link Between Worlds is having with itself. How much does the portrait of Zelda need to shift? Some would say a lot, others would say very little. And yet looking at the ease with which Worlds pulls off its dungeons in a free-form environment where you're given nearly all of the game's tools at the beginning, it's hard not to be impressed. For their first attempt, I have to say they were already pretty damn close to perfection. I've played A Link Between Worlds all wrong, I'm pretty sure. They say you can do things in whatever order you'd like, but you'd never know that watching me. I've beaten the game at least half a dozen times, and it always goes the same way. I get annoyed by all the giant rocks in the way, I go to the thieves' hideout to get the sand rod so I can go to the desert palace and get the Titan's mitt. Then I go to the swamp palace because it's nearby. Now you might think Turtle Rock is next since it's closest, in which case you'd be 100% correct. So I hurry up there, then Dark Palace, finishing things off with Skull Woods and then Ice Ruins. That order, every single time. I did it again for this most recent playthrough. Except this time, I guess I finally snapped. I knew I wasn't embracing the spirit of the game, but would doing things in a different order really change my experience? I had to know. This is what prompted me to restart the game in hero mode, with a promise. The first dungeon I would do is Ice Ruins. The last dungeon I would do is Desert Palace. Now, I understand the flaw in my methodology. I had just changed two variables at the same time. Who's to say whether any difference in experience would be more the result of my choice in dungeon order or the harder difficulty of hero mode? Counterpoint, does it really matter? Because what I'll tell you is that this was one of the most exciting playthroughs of A Link Between Worlds I've had in a while. So many things about the game I had previously found undercooked were starting to make sense. Because of the rental system, a lot of Worlds' hidden chests tend to be large rupees. This is fine in the early game, but as you get enough money to outright purchase all of your items, these hidden chests become more of a nuisance by the end. Such is the case with one of the chests in the Ice Ruins, where you have to use the upgraded energy gauge to merge across a windy, misshapen wall on the dungeon's outskirts. It's one of the neatest secrets in the game, but I've never had a use for it since I always do the Ice Ruins last. Rupees are irrelevant to me at that point. But now that I was starting with Ice Ruins, what was once useless became a deliberate stopping point. That's how a different order of dungeons can start to change things. Hero mode was clearly having an impact too. Its extra difficulty was part of the reason why I was sure to prioritize getting rupees. Thanks to the rental system, if you die, which will happen more frequently in hero mode, you have to re-rent all the items you haven't already purchased. That meant I had to be strategic with Bravio's shop. I knew that the tornado rod and bow were only really utilized in the early game, so it wouldn't be a big deal if I held off on purchasing those items and lost them along the way. The boomerang was almost completely situational, so I wouldn't even bother. I already knew the Desert Palace was my last dungeon, so I could hold off on the Sand Rod. On the flip side, because the Ice Palace was my first target, the Fire Rod definitely needed to be bought ASAP, while the bombs and hammer are so widely used across the game, I knew I should prioritize them. And that was the general strategy. Minimize wasting rupees by only buying the items I knew I would need in the immediate moment and forgetting about the rest. This was a wise decision because during my adventure in the Ice Ruins, I started dying a lot. It would have been a prudent choice for me to go to the Swamp Palace first so I could get the tunic upgrade and mitigate damage, but since I was already determined to do the ruins first, I did not have that luxury. Everything was one or two-shotting me. Link would stub his toe on something and just fall to the ground. Special shout out to this horrendous penguin mini-boss, who killed me 4 different times. Hero mode also recontextualized another element of the game I wasn't too fond of, the many hidden fairy fountains and dungeons. It was just never a good feeling to find a secret room or follow an unintuitive wall merge only to be met with a bunch of fairies I would never use because there was never a chance of me dying. But like with the hidden rupee chests, my new playthrough had given new salience to these secrets. I now made it a point to stop off at the hidden fairy fountain inside the Ice Ruins because I knew it would be essential if I was going to go in without a lot of heart containers. My run improved after the Ice Ruins, despite a hiccup in Turtle Rock and the lack of Titan's mitts occasionally making things inconvenient, but I am now fully convinced that Hero Mode is the ideal way to play this game. With a little touch of added difficulty, A Link Between Worlds' already smartly conceived ideas harmonize that much better. Everything seems to have its place in a way that wasn't quite as true upon first playthrough. And with my unorthodox dungeon order, I was finally able to feel the value of some of the game's useless secrets. I can't be sure what exactly was more influential, but if I had to hypothesize, I'd suppose my choice of dungeon and hero mode were having an interaction effect on my enjoyment. I always did the same order because I was sure the Titan's Mitt was the most important thing to get. It's what I would recommend doing to anyone that asked me. But now, having this encore with the game, I've been opened up to equally interesting alternatives so many years after the fact. It's fitting, I think. An adjustment here, a little tweaking over there, a new attitude guiding the way. In following A Link Between Worlds' example, it seems even the most well-worn of experiences can be renewed.